All right, hey everyone. My name is Jill Oberly, and I am a professional counselor at Caris House. And I'm here with my colleague Rachel Hodges, and we are a part of the Caris Kids team. So we get to meet with kiddos and their parents and teenagers, and get
Colleague
to
Rachel
walk with them
Hodges.
through lots of um, yeah, just various kind of concerns or difficulties. And we decided back in March when all of COVID-19 kind of wildness hit to start Parent Pause because we ourselves are mothers, and so we know what it's like to parent in the season. But we also just felt like we wanted to hopefully provide support to you all. And so it's been a couple of weeks since we've been in this space, been doing this together, but we're really glad to be back. And so just as we begin the night, I would really invite you all to take a moment and just pause, to take a deep breath, to grab a glass of water, to find a cozy spot just where you can really pause and be present, because Rachel has some really wonderful, sweet words to share with us tonight. So with that, I'm going to pass it along to you, Rachel.
Right. Thank you, Jill. Welcome, everybody. Like Jill said, are just glad to have this moment with you tonight, and glad to have space to just continue the conversation about what it is that we're navigating as parents today as we seek to care for our children and our teens in these days. And so tonight we are going to continue talking about grief. Wanted to point your eyes to a video that was emailed out to those of you guys who are journey attenders a few weeks ago. I believe it was Sunday, May 24th-ish. It was emailed out to you. And in that, we just started talking about grief. And so the reason we feel like grief is important is because as we look at the landscape of the last few weeks and months, we know that for all of us personally, and as we look at our families and we look at our children and we look at just our community and our church in general, there has been a lot of loss. And so we really wanted to have space to talk about that. And first, we would just want to acknowledge that loss and grief is a part of living in this world. And I know for me as a mama, that's a hard reality that even my 7-year-old and my 4.5-year-old and my baby know disappointment and know loss and grief. And so because we live in this world where things are not as they should be and are not perfect, we know that we all face loss and disappointment. And as parents, we often wish, like I said, that we could protect our kids from that and our teens from that, but we know that that's not reality. And so we just wanted to have some space to name that and to start to think about how do we navigate that and what do we do with that as parents. And so to start, I wanted to really talk about what is grief and what kind of how do we make sense of it, or what is our definition. And so we would say that grief, or the process of grief as we're thinking about it, is really the normal and the natural response to loss. That because, like I said, the world is how it is, that there are all sorts of losses that we are regularly facing, whether it's the loss of routine, of relationship, the loss of events or something we were looking forward to, whether it's failed expectations, that those are losses. Those are things that we grieve. Sometimes it can be the loss of trust in ourselves or others, because we were really hoping something would go a certain way, or someone would provide or show up for us in a certain way, and they weren't able to. Sometimes that loss is unmet needs, missing others, missing closeness. And it's important to name these losses because this helps us understand that when we think about grief as a normal and natural response to loss, it means there's actually a way that we as humans are created to respond to this, to respond to the reality of loss. And I think something that's important to notice is other losses that we face here on earth are things like the loss of safety, that we don't feel when we don't feel secure or safe or comfortable, or when we feel uneasy, that those are actually things that we will be moved potentially to grieve. because we were created to feel safe and soothed and secure. And so when we don't have that experience, there's a loss there that our body will move towards going through the process of grief. So again, as we're thinking about grief tonight, as we're talking about grief, we consider grief to be the normal and the natural response to loss and the losses that we face here. So as we get started, I just want to invite you to pause and to consider, what is your family grieving in this season? Yeah. I think as I ask that question, I think um, it feels like in this moment where we're at right now, there are so many ways that probably each of you could answer that question for your family. I just think when we know collectively the things that we as a society and a culture, the collective things that we're grieving, there are just so many things. So I really do want to invite you to think about, what specifically is your family grieving? What losses are you specifically having? Because um, yeah, when we're part of the bigger losses and things are happening more collectively for our culture, we really want to think through, how is this specifically hitting my family, and how is this specifically, how are we processing this? Because that can have us just have clear eyes to see ourselves and the people that we are caring for closely. So just invite you to consider, what is your family, or what is your family potentially lost in this season? And with that, I also ask you to consider specifically your kiddos. What does it actually look like for your kiddos and for your children and for your teens? A lot of those things will really overlap with you and your losses, but some will be different. And some of the things that maybe they will experience as loss, you won't. And some of the things that you will experience as loss, they won't. And so it's good for us to think about that for your whole family. But I'd also invite you to spend some time considering, for you guys specifically, what are the losses that you're navigating? What is the grief that you're facing? So as we continue, I just want to give you a few important things to think about and to know as we talk about grief. Um, as we start the conversation. So, one thing that's important to think about as we think about grief is, first of all, grief is this big thing that there's lots of information out there about, that it's the word that can be kind of used in passing. So there's just a lot of context there and a lot of words. So a lot of us kind of come to the idea of grief already with the framework already shaped by what we've been exposed to in our families of origin, prior losses that we've had, different things that we've learned about it, how we hear it talked about in culture, all sorts of things like that. But what's important to know about grief is that we don't always grieve in the moment in the ways that we expect, right? I think oftentimes when you think about grief, you think about tears, and tears can definitely be a part of grief. But sometimes we think that grief is like the tears and that initial feeling that we have in the moment. And what we know is that grief is actually a much bigger, more complex process than just those tears. Those tears are important. They're a part of the story and a part of the grief, but grief in of itself is actually a pathway and a processing towards adaptation and towards acceptance of the losses that we face. It's not necessarily just that initial first response that we can easily associate grief with. Um, Another thing that we think is important to note about grief is, while there are responses to loss that many people have, there's not necessarily a typical response. It's not like a three-step process or a very clear step-by-step linear process. It's much more um, yeah, of an ongoing unfolding. And so we do know that there's talk of the 5 stages of grief. And they are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And that's a really helpful framework, because those are the things that help us to identify kind of like, where are we at in our grief and how we're processing this, or where are our kids or our spouse or our friends. So we want to remember those things. Again, it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And again, while that's a very helpful framework, sometimes when we hear that framework, we can think it's a very linear, like, first I feel this, and then I feel this, and then I feel this. And what we actually know is that the experience of grief is very individualized, because we're all individual people. And you guys might even be experiencing this as you're walking through the season with friends or loved ones or your kiddos, how we are each experience this season. While there might be some similarities, it's also very specific to probably who you are and what your story is and what you bring to this specific loss. And so I just think that that's helpful for us to remember, and can also just bring clarity sometimes if you feel like, man, this, I feel like the way that I'm experiencing this is different than my spouse, or it seems like my kiddos are experiencing the same thing so vastly differently. And why are we all being impacted in such a different way when we're actually walking through a very similar season? And yeah, there might be people that you can really connect with and how you're experiencing this, but there might be other ways that you feel um, yeah, confused by that, because that can be potentially confusing if it seems like, or if the expectation would be that we would all be making sense of losses in the same way. So we just wanted to start with remembering those things. Um, yeah, so tonight we really did want to point our eyes to what does it look like to care for the teens that we're in relationship with and the children that we're in relationship with as we walk through seasons of loss and disappointment. And so in that email that had the video that Journey Kids emailed out on May 24th, I introduced in a video 6 guideposts for grief. So I want to just review those in case you didn't have a chance to watch that before tonight. And then I'm going to talk specifically about a few of them. So again, these guideposts are not a action step or a direct line, but it's just as you think about grief and what it looks like to walk through these seasons, some specific things we wanted to point your eyes to. And the first one was that we want to put on our own oxygen mask first. So I'm going to talk more about that one tonight, but it's basically the idea of as we seek to care for others, we need to be aware of how we are doing and know that our care overflows from how we are doing. And so we really want to be mindful of what does it look like to make sure that my needs are being met in this season. The next guidepost was to be aware of your attitude and thoughts about grief. So that's the other one I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, but it's just this idea that we bring our own understanding to grief and to loss. And so we want to be aware of what that is as we walk our children and our teens through different losses. Okay, the next guidepost was attuning to our children. And so when we talk about attuning, it means we really want to be able to see and make sense of their emotions, their thoughts, and their behaviors. So one of the reasons that we bring this up and consider a guidepost is especially when we are facing loss alongside of our children, we want to be really mindful of looking at our child and making sense of where they're at based off of what they're showing us through their thoughts, through the emotions that they're sharing, through the behaviors that we're seeing, because that's really how we can get a sense of how they're doing, which is how they communicate with us. And so often we can bring our own assumptions or conclusions to how our child are doing or is doing without necessarily really first seeing um, what are they expressing to me? And we don't, a lot of times that just happens because life is moving and it's moving fast, but we really want to practice slowing down and attuning to our kiddos. The next guidepost was remembering our kiddos' basic needs. And the idea of regulation and yeah, providing for those needs amidst all of the loss and the processing of everything else that's going on. The next guidepost was allowing ample time for true play. So we talked a little bit about what true play is and how play is a major way that we work out emotions. And that's especially true for our kids. It's also true for us as adults, but especially true for our children, that how they process the world and how they think and feel about things is really through true play. So we want to make time for that. And then the last guidepost was to remember that you know your child. And so that in the midst of all the losses that we're facing now, even though we might not have specifically dealt with the current losses before, you probably have walked with your child through some loss before, and there's probably so much that you know about their temperament and how they make sense of things that can really help guide you as you're making the decisions that you're making. And while we believe that it's so good to seek out resources and help, and we want to even be a resource and a place of help for you, we never want that to come at the cost of parents remembering that you guys really are experts on your kids. And so we're here to support and provide guidance in the ways that we can, but don't ever want that to feel like you need to look outside of what you already know and what your intuition says about who your kid is. We just think that that's really valuable to always remember as parents, as mamas who are always learning more and more about our kids, but also to always remind you of. So those were the main guideposts. Again, that was a pretty um, quick walkthrough of them. So I would highly encourage you to go back and watch that video if you haven't gotten to do that yet. Um, but for where we really wanted to settle on tonight when we think about grief and how to guide our children through grief is really to go back to those first two guideposts, which were beware of our attitudes and thoughts as parents about grief and loss, as well as to be sure that we're putting our oxygen mask on. And a lot of that is really focused on, we know that we as parents can't take our kids places that we haven't been, and that our kids really pick up on us and how we're doing and on what we are communicating through our nonverbals in these seasons. And so just being really mindful of that about ourselves, and kind of where we're at and what we need can really help be sure that we're communicating what we want to as we guide our kids through these seasons. So to start to look at being aware of our attitude about thoughts and grief and loss. Again, we want to remember that our kids really take their cues from us when we think about grief and loss. So if we seem to avoid loss or to be really overwhelmed by something or to think that it feels scary, they will pick up on that and think that that is true as well. And so when we're thinking again back to that initial definition that grief is the natural process of processing losses, it's really good for us to be mindful of how do I think about grief and loss. And I know for me, as I've just been thinking about this more and more in this season, like when I think about closure or endings, I kind of cringe. I'm like, oh, I don't know that I want to go there. That feels, all sorts of things. And that I have to know that about myself, that sometimes when I'm looking at endings, my desire is to like kind of pull away and put that on the shelf until later and not necessarily to want to go through the whole process of feeling that loss or grief. And so if that's my tendency, that's likely what, if I'm not really mindful of it, that is likely what my kiddos would pick up on of like, oh, we don't want to talk about that thing coming to an end, or we don't want to lean into that. And so that's just a small personal example of how we want to be aware of what is our thought about grief and about loss, and to really wrestle with the reality that grief and loss is a helpful natural process. And are there ways that I'm approaching this or thinking about this that is helpful? What are the ways that I'm thinking about grief and loss that are helpful? And maybe are there other ways that lead me to being more stuck or more avoiding leading in? And we just say that's important to think about. Because it's through really acknowledging that we can start to move towards potentially leaning in a little bit more and figuring out maybe what are the barriers to moving forward in grief. Um, so again, we want to really grow in understanding grief and the process of grief as a natural response to loss. That again, as humans, we need a way to process the energy and the emotions and the experience of the loss of something. So whether it's the loss of something we were looking forward to or the loss of a loved one, we are going to experience that loss not only in a cognitive sense, but also a lot of times we carry loss in our bodies, either the tension we feel in our shoulders or the pit of loss or fear we might feel in our stomachs, that we as embodied people, we experience and hold our grief. So we want to move through the grieving process. So there's a way for that energy to continue to work itself out. So something that is really helpful to know when we think about grief and loss, both in really obvious losses, as well as some hidden losses, is that there are patterns in how we respond in humans as humans. We can have feelings or physical experiences of numbness, having a hard time concentrating, kind of like our cognitive engagement can be impacted. And this is true for adults and for kiddos. We also know that there can be changes in eating and sleeping, and our desire to physically move or be active, that sometimes we can see those things um, either decrease or increase. Um, we know that there can be various emotional highs and lows when we're walking through loss and grief, and that with that, there can be sometimes a change in behavior. And so the reason that I just want to say that and note that tonight, like I did in that video, is because oftentimes, if we see that our kiddos having a hard time eating, or that we're having a hard time eating or sleeping in the midst of loss, that can feel really alarming and scary. And we can be like, oh no, what's going on? And so it's just helpful to know that some of that is a natural process of grief, and it doesn't necessarily mean that something is off track. It might. We want to be mindful of it. We want to pay attention to it, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It could mean that, yeah, we're grieving. We are facing this loss and walking through this disappointing time. And so I think that can help garner some compassion for ourselves and for our children in the midst of um, yeah, walking through these seasons of actually living out how the world is not how it was meant to be. So again, I would just want to remind us of that. It's expected. It's not surprising that with both obvious losses and hidden losses, that there are patterns in the ways that we respond as humans. Again, that's numbness, difficulty concentrating, having a hard time engaging, some of that cognitive involvement, the changes in our physical patterns of eating, sleeping, um, movement, things like that. The various emotional highs and lows, and with that, potential changes in behavior, that those things would, um, yeah, we would anticipate would be a part of grief. Um, okay, and then something else um, that I would think is just important to note as we think about our attitude and our thoughts and kind of what we bring to the table when we're thinking about grief or loss is that sometimes, in an effort again to protect our children, we want to do what we can to protect them from being upset, or to protect them from kind of like help them avoid hard feelings. um, and so we don't talk about it, and so we don't lean in as often. Like, maybe we want to see, like, hey, how are you doing about this thing? But they're having a really good time, or it seems like they're okay, so we don't want to start that conversation. We just want to remind you that it's likely that they are upset about some of the losses that they're walking through, and it is okay to ask. And it's okay to check in and to give them the option to talk about, because the reality is they're probably already upset. And so we don't want, um, to kind of fall in this pattern of not talking about things and not making those avenues open for communication. And so if you ask them and they're like, not into talking right now, or don't seem responsive, that's okay. Let them go on their way. But they still have then experienced from you that, hey, mom or dad's cool talking about this with me. Or, maybe they didn't want to talk about it in that moment, but like, you're setting the culture in your family that, like, we can revisit the loss and the grief that we're experiencing. So yeah, with that, I would invite you just to consider a few questions. So I'm going to read them, would encourage you to make some space to reflect on them yourself, maybe talk about them with a friend or a spouse, but I'd really invite you to start thinking about, what is your initial response to loss or grief? Are you likely to freeze or to feel numb? Potentially, are you likely to run another direction or distract yourself or try to avoid that discomfort? Um, are you more likely to lean in? And if there are some grief and loss moments that you're likely to lean in, what are they compared to maybe what are some ones that you're more likely to pull back from? Yeah. So again, that question is, what is my initial response to grief or loss? The next question I invite you to consider is, how were losses handled in your life as a child and in your family of origin? And is there any similar patterns there? Do you see that the way that you respond is a lot like that? Or maybe is it the opposite? And then lastly, I'd invite you to think about, how were losses talked about in your family? And how did your parents engage you? Yeah, and so with those questions, I want to invite you not to to avoid, maybe if you have an instinct or an urge to be hard on yourself, really want to kind of ask you to pause in those moments and kind of feel a little protective of you there, because it's important for us to know that our initial responses to grief is often we're doing the best we can with what we have learned, and we're doing what we know and what's been modeled for us and what feels safe. And so, again, we want to be mindful of that, because we know that we carry those things with us, and we have an opportunity to really reflect on, is this helpful? And is this serving me or my family, or is it leading to behaviors I don't feel good about, or coping strategies I don't feel good about? And so just want to be honest with ourselves, and at the same time compassionate about why we do respond the way that we do. Um, so that if for some reason there's ways that we've dealt with grief, that we, yeah, again, that we don't feel good about, that we can move towards change and healing in ourselves. Um, okay, so I've talked a lot about what it looks like to really be honest about what we bring to grief and to loss, and how that will overflow into how we guide our kiddos through grief and through loss. And now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that oxygen mask. So when we think about the oxygen mask, that analogy comes a lot from, or is really taken from the airlines, right? If you've flown an airplane before, the beginning of the flight attendants talk about how if you're traveling with a young child, make sure that you secure your oxygen mask on first before you help anyone else around you. And so the reason for that, right, is because we as humans have needs, and in that moment, you need oxygen and you need to be breathing if you're going to be able to help anybody else breathe. And so that's really the idea here, is that especially as parents and as caregivers, we are caring for little and big human beings that have a lot of needs. And no matter how long you've been parenting, I think you probably know that there's not really a pause point for those needs. If they continue to come, that there's just an ongoing, regular cycle of life where there's just not a relief or a release from the different ways that our kiddos need us to care for them. And so, in order to be able to do that well, we really also have to figure out how we can be caring for ourselves and can be cared for by other people as well. And so just wanted to talk about some practical ways to do that. You hear that analogy sometimes, so we really wanted to break down, okay, what might that look like in my life? And so I've just had some things we wanted to invite you to think about. And the first thing we would suggest is to really allow yourself time to check in with your own needs. And so I think for each individual, this can look different, but to really be honest with yourself about, when am I thinking about what I need? Do I think about what I need? And with this, we're really thinking about things such as regulation and relationships. So when we think about regulation, it's a lot of the stuff that Jill has talked about in some of her prior Parent Pause videos, when she has looked at things like our engine that she talks about. What we're really thinking through here are physiological needs of sleep, of nutrition, of exercise, and of relational connection. So with connection, I invite you really to be considering in this season, who is caring for you, or what relationships do you have access to with other adults that are mutually are giving and receiving. And then do you have any relationships where just you are receiving care and are on the receiving end? And I invite you to really consider, does that feel, does it feel like it's meeting the need right now, or might that need to be something different? So maybe you have a really close group of girlfriends, but with everything going on, it's just been harder to connect in this COVID season. So what would it be like to just say, hey, like, I'm feeling a little disconnected right now. Could we set up some time to get together, or something like that? Is really honestly answering, where are you at relationally? And so with that, just really being intentional to make space to check in with, where are you at, again, connection wise, and in the process of receiving from other adults. Would also encourage you to reflect on things like time alone, or times for rest and reflection. And so I know for a lot of us, depending on our our parenting situation and our caregiving situation, we might not feel like we have access to things like time alone, or maybe even like we want time alone. And so I just want to invite you to consider, what does rest and restoration look like for you? And so for some people, it might be saying that they're going to sneak in a walk by themselves a couple times a week, or um, how they do their bedtime routine once a week is going to make space for a little bit more time alone, or something like that. Again, this is very individualized because it really depends on how you're made and what brings you rest and restoration and joy. Another thing we'd invite you to consider is, what does it look like for you to have time to play or to create? Just like I talked about earlier, for kids, that play is a way that we as people really work out um, how we're making sense of what we're facing, our emotions, our thoughts about things. And we know that this is true for kids, and we also know that this is true for adults. And so I really invite you to consider, how do you enjoy playing, and how do you enjoy creating? And is there space for that? Is there ways that we can be creative, and how there can be space for you in that in this season? And then I'd also invite you to ask a question I think we should all be asking regularly: is there anything that I'm engaging with right now that, based on my current capacity, needs to either be paused or needs to be stopped? That is a huge way we can be mindful of our own oxygen mask and what we're pouring out versus what we're pouring in. Are there ways I'm pouring out that maybe in the season I have less capacity for, and I just need to name that? Yeah. Um, So again, kind of like I said about earlier, as far as like allowing time to check in, I really would encourage you guys to consider, what does that look like for you right now, on a daily basis? Really thinking through your daily needs. Are you remembering to eat? Sometimes we have, I know sometimes people have a really hard time remembering to like eat and drink water and things like that. And if you, it might be helpful to have a little prompt, whether it's a reminder on your phone or something like that. Um, yeah, to just have a regular practice of, if there are daily ways you want to be caring for yourself that you're not, how can you invite yourself to rem- have little reminders of that throughout the day? And then also to be thinking about this on a weekly basis and a monthly basis as well. So as you're thinking about planning your week, to just would invite you to consider, what does it look like for me to also be asking at the beginning of a week, how can I care for myself this week? And how can I make space for that? Because the reality is, what we know is that we as people are adaptive creatures, and it has now been a couple of months since a lot of our world has shifted, and there has been so much that has unfolded and that we're continuing to walk through since, yeah, COVID started and the stay-at-home orders, and everything that's unfolded since then. And so we just want to be aware that oftentimes at the beginning of those seasons, there's a big push of adrenaline and of making it and of like getting to the next day. And we often can then just be moving and moving and moving. And I would imagine that a lot of us, if you haven't already, you might now be at a point where you feel like you're just running on fumes. um, and that's hard because it's just the beginning ish of summer. And so we would really just encourage you, if you are feeling like you're at that point of feeling a little yeah, just deflated or worn or weary. There is just a reality to the weariness of the season, and that is okay. And in that, just want to invite you to have space to figure out, maybe you can't care for yourself in all the ways that you want to or even need, but are there ways that you can be taking steps forward in um, yeah, and caring for yourself and putting on your oxygen mask, so that you are able to continue to meet your kids where they're at, as we're all walking through the season of loss and grief. Yeah, so some questions I'm going to leave you with that are, just to consider, what are some ways that you have been caring for yourself in the season? I want you to start there. What are ways that you are already doing this? It's so easy to think of all the ways we want to be doing it and to miss that there probably are things that you're actually doing. And so I'd love for you to think about that and to name it and to write down like what has felt good. And yeah, let's celebrate those together. What are the ways that you are caring for yourself in this season? The next question I would encourage you to ask are, what are some additional ways that would feel good to care for myself right now? What are maybe one, two, maybe three things, three steps forward I want to take in meeting some of my own needs right now? And then lastly, I would encourage you to ask yourself, who can I ask for help? Is there a way that you could invite someone to care for you as you are seeking to care for others? Whether it's, again, a one way receiving or a mutual care back and forth, are there ways that you can be inviting people to care for you? Okay, so again, I want to invite you to be really gentle with yourself as we think about this. You are carrying a lot. We are contending with so much as we parent today. And so our heart is not that this would be another list of shoulds, but more that it would just be an invitation to really consider, um, yeah, where you're at and what you need right now. So let's pause and take a few deep breaths together. Mm. Okay, again, so I think as we close out this section and talking about grief, I just want us to remember that grief is proof that we are living in a world that is not as it should be, that we are living in a place where there's so many ways that we see in our bodies, in our relationships, in our families, in our churches, and our structures of society and education and things like that. We are literally seeing how sin is causing um, all these beautiful things to be broken. We're seeing the unraveling effect of sin, and we know that the truth is that we were meant for a garden, to live in a beautiful, peaceful place where we were seen and known and cared for and delighted in and in perfect relationship. Um, and we're just not there. That's not the reality that we're living in. And so, as we talk about grief, it makes sense that sometimes that's uncomfortable or feels overwhelming. And it doesn't mean that you're getting it wrong. It just means that we live in a world that is hard. And again, it's not what it was intended to be. Um, yeah. So I say that just as an invitation. I think it's important for us to be honest about the reality of that, um, so that we can be gentle with ourselves and our children and our teens as we navigate the difficult realities that um, our life is that we are facing in our life these days. Yeah.
Thanks, Rachel. That was just all a good word and good reminders of just the work that it takes for us to lead our kids in their grief and in their emotions really has to start with us. So I just appreciate your words in that. This is usually a time in Parent Pause where we answer questions. So if you have questions related to what Rachel just spoke to about grief, or any kind of just practical questions maybe you have about your kiddos, the teens that you're caring for, feel free to post those in the comments, and we'll hopefully get to answer some of them. Or if you have a question, maybe that you don't think of until later tonight or when you wake up in the morning, at a later time, you can always email your questions to us. Rachel, what is the email for that?
Yeah, thanks. It is parentpause@thejourney.org.
Okay,
You can
awesome.
email at any time. Mhm.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm looking at our feed. It looks like we're not getting any questions for tonight. Rachel, you just did such a good job.
Talked about all the things.
All things. Yes, you
Mm,
have left
yeah.
us all with really good questions to just be reflective about. And I know those are things that I want to also take home and think through as well. So thank you for that. Okay, well, so with that, I am going to just kind of provide our last moment to pause together tonight. Just a prayer that I want to read over each of you, yeah, as we kind of enter back into lives as parents and caregivers. And so if you'll just, yeah, close your eyes, maybe take a deep breath, and just hear this prayer. Um, Lord, as we end our evening, we thank you. We thank you for this place to pause and space to be. We thank you that you see us and know us and hold all things. We trust that you know our joys, concerns, and curiosities about our children. We trust that you know our grief and our children's grief and that you care. Help us to know your presence and to learn your voice. Help us to take from this evening what you have for us and to leave everything else. Lord, gather us to be with you as you are with us and help us to know your delight. Amen. Rachel, do you want to share at all about kind of plans for next Parent Pause and when that might be?
Yeah, I will. So our next parent pause will be 2 weeks from tonight. That will be June 30th is our plan. And that is a night that we have set aside specifically for talking about adolescence and those teenage years. So we are looking forward to really sitting there for an evening and really focusing on how to care for teens in the season, that stage of adolescence, and just the specific things we know that they're walking through in the season of quarantine and the way that the school year ended, and as we're looking to the fall, things like that. So we hope that you can join us. Even if you're not the parent of a teen, if you know the parent of a teen, we encourage you to invite them to come. And um, yeah, it's never too early to start preparing for adolescence, I don't think. Right? Yeah. Well, all right. Thanks for being with us tonight, you guys.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Talk to you soon.